Hello everyone, thank you all for joining me for this presentation on our recent work in tissue laser ultrasound imaging. To begin, so what's the problem we're trying to solve here? Unlike CT, X-ray, and MRI, ultrasound requires contact with the patient to generate an image. This means, based on how the clinician orients the probe and how hard they compress the tissue, a different image is generated each time. As you can see here on the bottom left, as more load is applied, the tissue is compressed and a different image is generated. Furthermore, quantitative measurements such as shear wave elastography would report higher tissue stiffness numbers due to the increased applied load because tissue is nonlinear and it also stiffens under load as well. So with all these together, the crux of the problem here is contact. So the question is, how can we remove contact from ultrasound image acquisition to alleviate some of these problems? And this naturally leads to using laser ultrasound, which is using lasers to both generate the ultrasound wave as well as to detect the returning waves on the tissue surface. This completely removes contact with the patient without any interference. And unlike in traditional photoacoustics, when we designed the system, we specifically chose wavelengths that would be preferentially absorbed right at the tissue surface, instead of wavelengths that would typically penetrate into the tissue and is absorbed somewhere deeper, typically in the blood vessels. And generally, this is more efficient because more light is absorbed rather than attenuated and scattered as it's propagating through the tissue. Because in general, light is attenuated 100 times more than acoustic waves inside of tissue, meaning that it is more efficient to propagate using acoustic waves to image deeper. Also, by having the source and detection right at the tissue surface, it operates more analogous to conventional ultrasound. But now the skin itself is becoming a transducer as opposed to putting a piezo on the surface. And on top of that, because we know the transduction is right at the tissue surface and we're measuring on the surface as well, we have a priority knowledge of the source location, meaning the source and receiver are both generated and detected right at the surface, meaning we know where they are, and that becomes important when we have multiple sources and multiple receivers, and if we ever want to do acoustic beamforming with multi-source and multi-receiver setups. So how do you generate a source like this? There are two conditions that must be met, the thermal condition and the acoustic and mechanical condition. Um, Without getting into too much detail, the equation essentially constrains energy to a small region right at the tissue surface. That's essentially saying that thermal and mechanical energy cannot propagate away faster than it is being generated or supplied by the laser in this case. And overall in this schematic, there's not too many knobs that you can turn in terms of the design. Mostly it's you because you can't really do anything that with the tissue. All you can do is tune your laser and change like things such as the intensity, spot radius, and the most important one here is the optical wavelength, because the optical wavelength directly determines how much light is absorbed and how deep the light will penetrate into the skin surface. It essentially dictates the transducer that you're generating within the tissue using the tissue itself. What we found is essentially that the amplitude of the generated acoustic wave follows closely with the optical absorption spectrum of water, which makes sense as most biological tissue consists of is mostly consisting of water. So this means that the highest energy pulses were generated around 1500 and 2000 nanometers, as you can see here. The line is the water optical absorption, and each of the small points is the amplitude or the energy of the acoustic waves that were generated. Um, However, in comparison between 1550 and 2000 nanometers, it actually made more sense to use 1550 because the safety margin for 1550 is much higher, it is 10x that of 2000. So if you're doing human subject imaging and trying to maintain safety, 1550 allows you to dump more energy into the tissue without violating safety restrictions for both eye and skin. And knowing that, we designed our system both around 1550 nanometer, both with the pulse source and the Polytech Doppler vibrometer. And this allowed us to generate the full full optical measurement. So this is transmission on the left and detection on the right. And as you can see, the pulse is measured directly at about 6 centimeters in distance, which corresponds to the thickness of the forearm shown here. And because we have free space positioning, we can also generate 3D images by raster scanning the laser on the surface as well. So this is done on a gelatin phantom with various metal inclusions. As I play this video, you can see each reflector showing up at different depths as the video progresses. And then it finishes with the back surface, which is another strong scatter. We again tested this on excised animal tissue and was able to capture soft tissue reflections between the muscle and fat boundaries as well. As you can see here on the waveform, the weaker reflections from the muscle and fat boundaries, and then the strong reflection from the air in the back. On the left is a linear scan on the tissue surface, and on the right is image taken using a GE Logic E9 system. As you can see, similar structures can be seen both. So the first reflection from the muscle and fat boundaries, and then the deeper reflections from the second boundary, and then the strong reflector from the air surface. And because we're eye and skin safe, we're also able to test on human subjects as well. So this is the same setup as the previous side with the laser image on the left and then the G image on the right. Again, similar images, similar features can be seen where there's light reflections from the muscle fascia and stronger reflections from the, deeper in the tissue from the bone surface. Overall, this has even more artifacts than the tissue, the excised animal tissue image, partially because there's motion during imaging. We're not at the same speed as traditional ultrasound yet, which means the patient has to subject has to stay still during imaging. And as much as we like to say we stay still, it is impossible to do it at the optical scale required. So there's a lot of variations as you're moving across. But regardless, we are sensitive to soft tissue reflections as well as the stronger reflections from the bone, and the features are comparable between laser ultrasound and ultrasound. So that is a very encouraging result. To wrap up, I'd like to thank my advisor Brian, along with Peter So and Marty Culpepper, who advised me on the project during my PhD, and the broader Device Realization Lab, and lastly, our sponsor and collaborators at MIT Lincoln Labs, Rob, Chuck, and Matt, as well as the MIT Clinical Research Center for their continued support. Thank you.